McCabe with us, talking about his new book, in addition to some other very interesting things in his career, which I'll tell you about in just a quick second. Hey, everybody. Is it testing? Can you hear me now? I am so not a rock star. Are we good? Okay, so here we are. Take 3. So we are in the Monaco Brewing Company Madison Tap Room with author and all-around interesting human, Mike McCabe. We'll be talking about his book tonight and some other things. There'll be a chance for audience Q&A from the folks here in our tap room. Just want to make a plug for the fact that we're going to be doing events pretty much every Tuesday night, originating here from the Madison Tap Room. We also have music on Thursdays and Sundays and some Saturdays. And we have karaoke twice a month on Mondays. And we're going to be having some open mics. And so we're going to be the place to be this winter when you're looking for stuff to do. This will be the place. So look us up on Facebook. And speaking of Facebook, we will be we're broadcasting out to the World Wide Web tonight on Facebook and Substack and YouTube. So hopefully you folks are out there and you can see us. And with that, let me just tell you a little bit about our friend, Mr. McCabe, and then we will give it over to him. Mike McCabe here is an author who's been a farmhand, journalist, educator, and civic leader over the course of his career. Am I right?
Right.
Okay. Mike had a rural upbringing, reared on his family's dairy farm, like a lot of us all, before going on to lead the independent government watchdog group, Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, for 15 years. He started the grassroots citizen movement Blue Jean Nation, which I love that name, and ran a spirited, I'm told, and I recall actually, campaign for governor of Wisconsin in 2018. Decades earlier, he ran a statewide civic education program and served a stint in the Peace Corps in the West African country of Mali, which is where I might have some questions, if that's okay. After having 2 nonfiction books published, Mike's first novel came out in October 24, Miracles Along County Q, which we'll be talking about tonight. It's set in a fictional Wisconsin town where the characters work through issues of identity, sexuality, and economic hardship to illustrate how life in rural areas of the state doesn't fit into stereotypes. Don't we know it? So without any other further words from me, again, my name is Teresa. And Kirk is here, by the way. If we got some Kirk groupies out there, I just want to let you know my boss is watching me. And so here is Mike McCabe. Thanks for coming in, Mike.
Thank you, Teresa. And hey, Kirk, thanks for opening your doors to me and hosting tonight. And hey, everybody out there. If anybody out there has followed the path that I've taken in life, if they are familiar at all with my journey, you're probably surprised to learn that I decided to try my hand at writing fiction and produced a novel. But I'll tell you this, that undertaking, which has been a glorious experience, by the way, that experience is not so far removed from the other paths I've taken in life, the rest of my journey. Because, when I look at what's going on in our country, when I look at what's happening in our world, there is all this lying being done, in all these official lies being told. And there's so much lying being done that it's given fiction a bad name. And there's all this Christian nationalizing that's being done that has really ruined the meaning of faith. And a whole lot of people have lost faith. They've lost faith in our country's leadership. They've lost faith in the way our society should be functioning. And I just decided I'm not going to take this lying down. And I decided to write this story that is a work of fiction, but it's one that takes on all of the challenges that we are struggling with in our lives today, and it is set in a fictional place called faith. It's been said that nonfiction is fact and fiction is truth. And I get whatever author coined that, I get where they're coming from, but I don't quite agree because I was trained as a journalist. That's my background, other than the fact that I grew up on a dairy farm and I come from farm country. When I chose a profession, I decided to be trained as a journalist, and I have practiced journalism for a long time. I've written in all kinds of different forms, and as Teresa mentioned, I've had 2 nonfiction books published. There's not that much difference between writing nonfiction and fiction. With nonfiction or any act of journalism, what you do is you do your research, you gather your facts, you string those facts together into a narrative that makes sense to the reader, that the reader can understand and relate to. And with fiction, you are also doing your research and basing characters and plot on fact. In this story, all of the characters are based on very real people. The place that is described in this story is based on not one community, but several small towns that I am intimately familiar with. And the events described in this book are all based on true events, things that actually happened, that I witnessed with my own eyes or I experienced directly. The difference between fiction and nonfiction, in my experience, is not that one is fact and the other truth, but rather the difference is imagination. What separates nonfiction from fiction is the use of imagination to create a fuller representation of reality and to get at deeper truth. And that's what I sought to do here. With the mess that we're in our country and the struggles that we have, we can easily decide what we're against. And we can easily decide how we're going to try to fight those things that we're against. But we also have to keep in mind that it's important to know what you're for, what you want to replace this mess with. And we need to imagine how to get to that place. And we need to imagine what force might be strong enough to overcome the hatred that is so pervasive in our society. We're constantly being put at each other's throats. And city folk are being told to hate country people. And people living in the country, the rural folks, are told to be suspicious and fearful of the people who live in cities. And all of this is to just keep us in a position where we can easily be kept under the thumbs of the very rich and powerful in our society. We have to be able to imagine a force strong enough to free us from that trap. And that's what this story is really all about. That's what I set out to do, was to brew a tonic for mad times, and there's no finer place than a good old fashioned tavern, selling beer and other products. And Kirk was telling me about some of the damnedest products that you got for sale here, and that can certainly help you get to a higher plane of consciousness. But what I set out to do with this book was to brew a tonic for mad times. And the book, very simply, it's a mystery with lots of twists and turns and an ending no one sees coming. And I mean no one sees the ending coming. And it's about outcasts who work wonders in a struggling country town. And I told this story because it has deep personal meaning to me. And this story is really based on my brother Dan, my late brother Dan. We had an offer of musical entertainment right in the middle of the show here. I wrote this because of my late brother Dan's impact on my life, and how he set me on a path that I wouldn't have traveled if I hadn't had him as a brother. So I'd like to tell you about a character that doesn't appear in the book, and that's my late brother. The main character in this story is called Ray Glennon. I didn't name the character Dan. That's my brother's name. But I really based the main character on my brother. You see, something happened at Dan's birth. Some mistake was made or some accident occurred, and Dan was deprived of oxygen for a period of time. And he sustained some brain damage, and that caused neurological harm that ended up manifesting itself in facial tics and twitches, muscular twitching. His eyes would sort of dart in his head or roll in his head. I think it's unrelated to those circumstances of his birth, but he also had this skin condition that led him to develop these very unsightly growths on his face. Well, you can imagine somebody with those physical abnormalities, with those twitches and facial tics, eyes that wouldn't quite stay fixed. You can imagine what that resulted in on the playground and in the hallways of schools. Dan was physically and emotionally tormented for years. That's not the story that I want to leave people with, though. The real miracle of Dan's story is not the cards he was dealt and the treatment he endured because he was dealt those cards. The miracle of Dan's story was how he dealt with it all. Because let me tell you this, I don't know if I have ever met a single person on the face of this earth who was friendlier and more engaging than my late brother Dan. And he had every reason to be the exact opposite. He had I know if it had been me in his shoes, I think I would have curled up in a ball. I would have tried to build a shell around myself just so I wouldn't be hurt anymore. He did the exact opposite. He chose instead to become this incredibly friendly and engaging person. And when my wife Marilyn and I were married, and I had gone to college by that time, and a lot of my friends were college educated, and a lot of people show up to the wedding, of course, with suits and ties. And here's this 5'5" factory worker. He was a burly guy. I was always tall and scrawny. He was short and squat and powerfully built. He loved NASCAR. I was always more interested in NATO. He was an avid hunter, loved to fish, was a lifetime NRA member. I loved baseball and basketball. So we didn't have a whole lot in common, and yet we were incredibly close as siblings. And if not for him, I don't think I would have ever become a Peace Corps volunteer. I know for a fact I never would have run for governor. I don't think I ever would have wound up leading the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. But you see, growing up in Dan's shadow made it impossible for me to become the bully. It made it impossible for me to treat others the way Dan was being treated. Growing up in his shadow taught me compassion and taught me empathy that I'm not sure I ever would have come by on my own. I might have fallen into the trap of all the behaviors that he was subjected to if I had not watched up close and personal him having to go through that. So I to this day, I feel some guilt having benefited so much from his pain. But to me, there was always a lesson in that story. There was always something that I wanted to share with others about that story, because he possessed a force that, if we could successfully channel it, is capable of overpowering hate. And that's what the story's about. It's a force strong enough to overpower hate. This is a story about a place where cruelty meets its match. And when people read this story and they read about Ray Glennon and what Ray Glennon endures, but also what Ray Glennon achieves in coming to the rescue of this struggling country town, I've had readers say, could that really happen? And my response is that it did. It happened. I watched it unfold in person. This is the story of my brother's life. I chose to write a fictional account. I chose not to write his biography because we lost Dan over 20 years ago. And I wanted this story to deal with today's struggles, with today's challenges, with the hate and the division and the polarization and the demonization and the dehumanization that so many are experiencing in today's America and in today's Wisconsin. And so I chose the route of fiction. But don't for a second think that means I decided to part company with fact, or I decided not to pursue truth. Because this story is a story of real people in a real place, and it's the real things that they experienced and the real successes that they were able to achieve. And the wonderful thing about using fiction as the vehicle is it does allow you to provide a broader representation of reality, because the characters are not based each on just one person, but they are composites of a number of people. The community, Faith, where I based this story, is based on at least 3 small towns that I am intimately familiar with. If I had only chosen one to portray, I wouldn't have been able to capture as many dimensions of small town life as can be captured in a novel. And so when I ask you to consider reading this book, Miracles Along County Q, I do that because I hope that this story that has such deep meaning to me and is about, at its core, a person who sent my life down paths that I would not have traveled and made me into someone I probably would not have ever become. And I hope that it's a story that has not only relevance to the current moment, but has deep meaning to those who are struggling so to find ways to overcome what we're all up against at the moment. So, like I said, this is not a departure from what I've done with my life, trying to shine light in dark corners and hold powerful people accountable, challenge those who wish to keep people under their thumb or to cast them out, demonize them or dehumanize them. That was Dan's life experience, and the way he handled it, I think, speaks so powerfully to what we all have in us, the potential that we all have to make a difference in our world. So let me stop there and turn this into a two-way conversation. You can take it in all kinds of directions, social, political, wherever you want to go. But love to hear your questions, and I'll do my best to share meaningful insights. Yeah, you get to go first, Kirk. Good old Joe. You know if the audience out there can hear the questions at all, or? Yeah, Kirk wants to take me back to my 2018 run for governor. It does seem like back in the 1900s, but and what my main takeaways were from that experience. I have to tell you, to be honest, I loved it and I hated it. I found it incredibly rewarding. I also found it deeply disturbing. So I had so many mixed emotions coming away from that campaign, but in the end, I have absolutely no regret. Here was my thought going into 2017, really. Scott Walker was governor. I thought he was doing tremendous harm to our state. I thought Wisconsin, to move forward, really needed to move on from Scott Walker. But he, of course, had been on the ballot for governor 3 times. And 3 times he had defeated who the Democrats put up against him. And 3 times the Democrats tried to clear the field and create a path for a nominee of their choice, kind of anoint somebody and clear a path for that person's nomination. And 3 times that was done, and 3 times it failed. 3 times Scott Walker defeated that Democratic nominee. And you know, there are 1,000 ways that the party can block you from getting its nomination. But there's one thing that the party cannot do, and that's prevent somebody from getting on the ballot and becoming part of the party primary. They can't stop you from doing that because Wisconsin law makes ballot access so ridiculously easy. If you have any kind of organization, if you have any kind of appeal as a candidate, you can get the signatures to get on the ballot and you can become part of that party primary. And I knew they couldn't stop me from doing that. So I knew that if I was any kind of candidate and my candidacy had any kind of appeal, that I would be able to change the dynamics of the race. And we would not have another election where an anointed Democratic nominee was put up for slaughter against Scott Walker. I knew that the party didn't like primaries. I didn't know just how much the party establishment hates primaries. And I spent a good 11, 12 months being told to drop out of the race so that they could clear the field. And they said, all you're doing is wasting our eventual nominee's time and money and making that person weaker against Scott Walker. And you're going to get Scott Walker elected yet again. And I respectfully disagreed with them, and I ran to the finish line. And it did Tony Evers no harm, because that was the election where finally Scott Walker was defeated. That was the election after a robust Democratic primary. There were 15 or 16 candidates on the Democratic side in the race at one point. 10 of us made the ballot. So there were 10 choices on the primary election ballot. And you know, a few dropped out of the race and stopped campaigning even though they were on the ballot. But hey, that primary was a vigorous and exhausting primary, and I think it made Tony Evers a better candidate and put him in a position to be able to beat Scott Walker. He didn't waste his time. He didn't waste his money. Scott Walker was going to have more money than any Democratic candidate in that race anyway. But what happened was for 11, 12 months, we had Democratic candidates fanning out across the state, going from city to city, town to town, rural village hall to rural village hall, telling people why Scott Walker needed to go. And when I went through Minocqua, or when I went through Wausau, or Stevens Point, or Cable, you know, the local newspaper would come and interview me, or a local TV or radio station would come and interview me. But then when the next candidate came through town, they felt obliged to cover them too. So over and over again, you had this message repeated about Scott Walker needs to go. It's time. And I think that ended up doing Tony Evers a lot of good. It didn't hurt him at all. So I think doing what I did was I did it because I believed that I had a chance to change the dynamics of that race. I could help make the outcome a different one than the previous 3 elections. And I was told over and over and over again how dead wrong I was. But in the end, Scott Walker was defeated. He was sent packing. And to me, that's what matters most. Now, I did come to realize just how much the party not only dislikes primaries, but is fearful of insurgent candidacies. But to me, that is all the more reason for more people to consider this as a path, consider this as an option, because it has a way of creating a new politics. It has a way of changing the political dynamics in our state and in our country. Primaries are nothing to fear. They are a mighty tool in the hands of citizens who care about the future of our country. How's the book going over up north? I was asked. Here's the interesting thing. I was actually invited to come up to Owen, which is where I went to high school. I'm a graduate of Owen Withee High School in Clark County. And this is Owen's centennial this year. It was a logging encampment. So Owen is much younger than the state of Wisconsin. It's only 100 years old. And they're having their centennial this year, and they decided it would be a good idea to have a local author come and do an event as part of the centennial, and they invited me to the public library. Much to my surprise, my visit was embraced by the mayor, by the local newspaper editor. A whole bunch of my high school classmates came to the event, and I had so many of them. And I was a little on edge when I made the drive up there because the book is partly based on Owen. The description of the community is based in part on Owen, and it was unmistakable to them. They got that. They also realized that certain events, some of them not flattering events in terms of what happened in a small town, they understood that some of those events happened in Owen. I was kind of nervous about how they might respond to the depictions and to the overall story. And to a person, they all said, "Oh man, you nailed it. That is spot on. The description of the community is spot on. And you really captured the way of life in a place like this." And I was relieved. I was also delighted. But I also admired the fact that it wasn't necessary for them to get a glowing or loving tribute to their community, but they were willing to read a story that depicts life there, warts and all. That says this is what happens in a small town. And part of the reason I wrote this story was because I come from a farm background. I come from from country life, and what frustrates me so much is how many stereotypes there are of small town life, and how many people think that everybody in a small town is white, when the town our farm was closest to, a little town named Curtis, is actually a majority minority community. It's a majority Latino. That's all the Latinos do all the cow milking nowadays, and so people think that everybody thinks alike, everybody acts alike, everybody is alike, everybody looks alike, and of course, small towns are much more complicated. and much less monolithic than people seem to think. And I wanted to capture that in this story. I wanted to sort of shatter that myth of the monolithic small town. And I wanted people to see that small towns are very stratified. There are people on top, there are people on the bottom. There are the people on top are looking down at the people on the bottom and are trying to keep them there. All of that stuff happens in small towns. And there is a line in this book, and I think I can share it with you without spoiling the reading experience if you choose to read the whole book. But there's this line in the book that says, everybody thinks everybody knows everybody in a small town, and everybody's wrong. My experience is that everybody may be familiar with everybody in a small town. They know who you are. They know your name. They know where you live. They know what work you do, but they don't really know you. They don't really know what's going on inside the walls of your home. They don't know all of the emotional struggles you're going through. They don't know you. They're just familiar with you. And yet you hear that said routinely, that everybody knows everybody in a small town. And this story is about a whole lot of people who don't know these people they've treated like outcasts. They've decided that they're not good people and should be avoided, when in fact they end up having these remarkable strengths that end up rescuing the community in so many ways. And so not only was I invited to Owen, I was also invited to Evansville. I did the very first part of my childhood was spent on a farm outside of Evansville in Rock County, to the south of where we are here tonight. And I was similarly nervous about going to Evansville because there's stuff in the book that is unmistakably drawn from my time in Evansville. And there too, people thought, wow, that's definitely Evansville you're writing about there. But they didn't recoil in horror. And so I'm proud of the readers in those small towns. I'm proud of the way people have responded, because their response also shatters the stereotype of the small town people who are provincial and think that their way of life is the only good way of life, and that everything is rosy where they live, because they know that's not true. They know that their towns are dying. And they fear for the loss of the way of life that they've known all their lives, and they're scared. And that fear and that experience I tried to bring out in this book. And again, being able to do a fictional account allowed me to blend all of these different experiences from all these different places, and I think come up with a much more vivid depiction, not only of small town life and small town challenges, but also small town triumph. So the question for those out in the viewing audience is how do you respond to people in small towns where you grew up, if you've experienced city life, and how do you take them to task for some of the things that are being done in their name and that sort of thing. Here's my I don't have a good answer to your question, and I don't have a great strategy here, but just let me share what's in my heart. When I've had what I consider to be the privilege of of living across the rural-urban divide. I've spent a good chunk of my life living in the country, and I've also lived in the city. I have had a chance to experience both city life and country life, and I feel like I've benefited greatly from that experience of sort of living with a foot on both sides of that divide. And because of the path that I've traveled in my life, including that 2018 campaign for governor, but even preceding that, all the traveling I did and all the speaking I did while running the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign and then starting Blue Jean Nation, I've had literally thousands of conversations with Trump supporters. It's into the many thousands. Here's the interesting thing: I don't think any two of them are alike. I've yet to meet two Trump voters who are alike. They have come to him for different reasons. They've found it. They've passed through different entrances to get to him. What does fascinate me is once they open a door and walk through it and enter that world, what fascinates me is that they don't stop with the reason that led them to that door in the first place, but they sort of embrace the whole enchilada then. And I know somebody who comes immediately to mind who went to Trump because she happens to be virulently anti-abortion. So it's the abortion issue because Democrats are all now pro-choice. There used to be anti-abortion Democrats, but that stopped happening years ago. And so they just figure whoever is the Republican nominee, that's who I've got to support because I don't support abortion. So she was willing to say, okay, I'm on the Trump train. But then when I talked to her, all of a sudden she's spewing all the anti-immigration stuff and the pro-tariff stuff and you name it. And she just embraced the whole philosophy. And that, I don't have a good explanation for that. And I can't explain it, but it's a phenomenon I've noticed. But all of these conversations have taught me that my best approach is to go into each one of those conversations without having the expectation of changing their mind. I actually think the most powerful thing that we can do in those conversations is show some empathy, show some genuine sincerity in our interest in what they're struggling with, and then show them some empathy, because that's the one thing that I've noticed can disarm them. They're on edge. They assume that you're the devil. They have been taught that you're evil because you come from, you've come to them from a city, or you are somebody known to have democratic leanings. So they're already sort of pre-programmed not to trust you and even go so far as to hate you. And if you show genuine interest in what's going on in their lives and show them some empathy, it's the one thing that seems to be able to disarm them. They don't know quite what to do with that. And it's a way to create a human connection that isn't done for the purpose of changing their mind, but I think does end up getting them to reflect on all of what they've embraced. And I can't tell you how many of those conversations ended with people saying in one way or another, they all phrased it a little bit differently, but they all said more or less, I don't agree with a whole lot you stand for, but you seem like a decent guy. And to me, that's as much of a victory as you can hope for. They come away thinking, not quite the devil spawn that I expected. Not quite the irrational, radical, ridiculous, bleeding heart that I thought I was going to encounter. There's a guy who can talk dairy farming, and there's a guy who can talk about what's going on in small towns and how when the local elementary school closes, that's a death sentence for that community, because what young family is possibly going to move there if there's no elementary school to send their kids to? And he's actually lived that, and he gets that. And I think that might be the best way. So I don't think it does any good to say I told you so, or how do you feel now about your choice, given the fact that grocery prices keep going up and so does the price of everything else, and we got these tariffs hurting us, the soybean farmers and all the other farmers, and you got all this stuff going on that is just catastrophic. I just don't. If I enter into that conversation trying to say I told you so, or trying to flip them, what I've experienced is that defenses go up, walls go up, and they just shut you out. And they're really good at changing the subject. If you try to pin them down on one issue, they just change the subject to another issue, and they're really good at doing that. So my sense is that, yep, right, yeah, exactly. But what about this? But what about that? And it's a great way to deflect, and they're really good at deflecting. And so what I've chosen to do, rightly or wrongly, for better or worse, is to try to make the conversation not political, but rather personal. And what I've found is that no matter who I'm talking to, there is some common thread that I can pounce on. I'll ask them what they do for a living. Well, my dad used to do that, or I got relatives who are in that business, hey, I used to live in a place just like that, or it's a small world, isn't it? Because we both got relatives in Evansville, or we both got family up in Clark County, and then when you find some kind of common ground, that's where the conversation can get beyond their stereotypes of me and probably my stereotypes of them, and I don't because I don't aim to change minds. I probably haven't changed any minds, but I think for people to change their minds and change their hearts, they have to come upon it themselves. They have to figure it out for themselves. They can't do it because somebody has said, you're a fool, or you're stupid, or you're this, or you're that. That won't do it. It's my other strategy is to ask questions rather than make statements. And I'll, they'll make one of those declarative judgments about people. And I've found a great question is to just say, how confident are you that that's actually happening? Or, on a scale of 1 to 10, how sure are you that that's true? And it's funny when they're told, when they're asked to put it on a scale of 1 to 10, a lot of times they'll kind of acknowledge, well, I'm not completely sure. But if you say, well, that's just, you've just been propagandized, you've drunk the Kool-Aid, and you're just flat out. And then they're 10 out of 10 that they're absolutely right, and they dig in their heels. But if you can get them to at least say, well, yeah, I'm not completely sure, then maybe they'll reflect on it a little bit. And you can tell there are people out there now who voted for Trump in 2016 and voted for him again in 2024, voted for him in 2020, even though soybean farmers. And now they're thinking, well, damn, this isn't working so well. So now what? But they've got to work through that on their own. And I don't think me telling them that they're fools is gonna expedite that process. How do you know we're the same age? It's a matter of public record that I'm past my prime. Yeah. The question was about my Peace Corps experience and how that changed me. And there was a long time motto for Peace Corps said it's the toughest job you'll ever love, and that was so true. And I, like every Peace Corps volunteer who's ever lived, would say without hesitation that I learned more than I taught, and I got more than I gave. That is a universal experience for Peace Corps volunteers. It was a life-altering experience. I am so lucky, so blessed to have been able to do that for 2 years. It changed the way I see the world, but it also changed the way I see my own country. I think when I had been living all my life in the United States and had never lived in another place, everything about America seemed completely normal. And then if you go to a place, especially like Mali in West Africa, where I did my service, life is, in almost every way, life is 180 degrees opposite of what it is here. And I'll just give you a couple of small examples, kind of still almost silly examples that sort of illustrate my point. In Mali, it is totally normal for women to go topless while working, while hanging out at home, but it is extremely important for them to cover their legs, and they wear these wraps that go down to almost the ankles, at least mid-calf. And it's extremely important culturally for women not to show their legs, but they can bare their breasts. Here it's the exact opposite. It's okay to wear the short skirt, but you're supposed to cover up on top. And so, what I realized is that there's so many elements of life that have nothing to do with human nature, but are just culture. And a more powerful example, a more meaningful example, is in Mali, there is a complete absence of privacy. And I never realized what an American I am until I went to a place that has no concept of a Western notion of privacy. You are in the presence of other people every single waking hour. You can't get away from it. It feels smothering to somebody from a Western upbringing. I used to actually go on bike rides out into the bush just to try to get 15 minutes away from people. Now, here's how extreme it is. I would sometimes be sitting we had this little mud hut with a thatch roof and no electricity, no running water. And I would sit in there sometimes and want to crack a book and just get some alone time and do some reading. And when I would do that, usually it would be a young person, but not always. But somebody would come and sit down with me in my own house. Just come on in and sit down. Sometimes, I remember this one young woman, she might have been in her late teens, maybe her early 20s. She came down and sat, didn't say a word, just sat there while I was reading. I later asked a good friend of mine, somebody I'd gotten to know and we spent a lot of time with and could communicate pretty well with. And I asked him, what's the deal with somebody coming and just sitting there? And he said, well, they think you're suffering. And so they're just trying to ease your pain because here, the only people who want to be alone are either mean or crazy. And if you don't want to be known as mean or crazy, you're going to have people around you all the time. And they're not doing it. They're just doing it to provide comfort because just human presence is that important in that culture. Well, that right there taught me everything I didn't know before about just how cold American life can be, just how isolating American existence can be. And so in Mali, I once asked two good friends, I asked what the Bambara word was for suicide. I asked in French, because they don't speak English there. So in French, I asked, what's the Bambara word for suicide? And he said, there isn't. Both of them said there isn't one. And I said, well, what do you mean? It's like when you take your own life. And one of them says, why would anybody want to do that? they don't have a word for it because they don't need a word for it. There isn't suicide in their communities. In part because there is such an intense social structure and almost an overwhelming or smothering sense of community that people never feel isolated enough to get to that point. And so I came away from that experience not thinking, wow, this is a shithole country. I came away from that experience with a great appreciation of just how rich we are in some ways, but also how poor we are in other ways. And what's fascinating is that they are rich in the ways we are poor, and they are poor in the ways we are rich. And that was my biggest single takeaway from my time. It wasn't the memory of malaria or dysentery. It wasn't, feeling like, oh, for crying out loud, I wish I had electricity or running water or television or whatever. That's what I came away with, was this amazing sense of cohesiveness and community that exists there, and the wealth that exists, the social wealth that exists in a country like that, and the relative social poverty in a country as economically prosperous as the United States. What's the next book? I wish I knew. I found it both humbling and incredibly fascinating trying my hand at fiction. It's a very different form of writing, one that I had not had experience with, but I found it magical. And here's the weird thing about fiction. When you write nonfiction, again, it's about doing your research, gathering your facts, stringing those facts together in a narrative. When it came to writing fiction, what I found was that sometimes the story seemed to have a mind of its own, and even characters would have a mind of their own. One character, I can mention her by name, that you run into in the book is a young woman named Chris Driscoll. Now, when I first mapped out the story in my head, I saw Chris being a very peripheral character, not a central figure at all. Not unimportant, but peripheral to the main storyline. And it was like she was dissatisfied with her role. And as I'm writing, I found Chris sort of asserting herself, kind of inserting herself into the story in places that I didn't necessarily imagine, and would take the story in directions I didn't anticipate it going. Now you start questioning your sanity a little bit when that happens, but I've since talked to other novelists who say, no, stories do have minds of their own, and characters have minds of their own, and they will take you in directions that you didn't plan on going. And that was the part that was really magical. Obviously, the story has very deep meaning to me because it is a tribute to my late brother. So there were times that I was sitting at the keyboard and tears were streaming down my face. There were other times when I was writing the story and I was laughing out loud as I was writing. And so it was great fun, sometimes painful, most times joyful, just writing the story. I would do it again in a heartbeat, but you know what? I don't currently have another story at the ready. And I don't really want to write another novel unless I come up with a story that has that deep a meaning to me. I don't want to just write to churn out the next book and sell some more books. I want it to be something that actually has meaning. 5-minute warning. The question is about me sharing my perspective on how we get out of this whole mess and get beyond the troubles that plague our country at the moment. I think one of the things that is so important for all of us to keep in mind is that we've been through this kind of thing before, and past generations encountered these very kinds of troubles, and they were able to endure and ultimately find light at the end of the tunnel. One of the things I often recommend to people, 2 books that I have personally found to be sources of great comfort. One is called The Upswing, and it was written by the author of another book called Bowling Alone. But The Upswing, and then Robert Putnam is one of the authors of The Upswing, and then the other one is The Fourth Turning. And there's actually a follow-up to the book. The book's a couple decades old, but there's a more recent follow-up, I think came out in 2023, called The Fourth Turning is Here. And it basically shows kind of the cyclical nature of change. And it shows how, society goes from the kinds of conditions that we're in. The fourth turning basically says that there are sort of 4 phases to social change. They call them turnings. And the fourth turning is when basically society collapses. And then out of that comes a phoenix moment where a new social order rises from the ashes. And that's known as the first turning. It's sort of a new birth, a rebirth of society. And those authors argue that we are smack dab in the middle of a fourth turning, where social institutions are crumbling, trust in each other and our institutions is waning. But then we are about to enter eventually a phoenix moment where a new social order will rise out of the ashes. And I think it's so important for us to draw from that kind of wisdom, but also just rely on our own instincts to understand that when hard times come along, they don't last forever, and that a rebirth can occur, that a new social order can rise out of those ashes. And we are seeing institutions crumble. We are seeing things burn to the ground. We're seeing an awful lot of things destroyed that we all care deeply about. So that's where, again, I say that fiction can play such an important role. We need to imagine together what that new social order should look like. We need to imagine what the answers will be. And I try to offer some thoughts about forces that are powerful enough to overcome the hate of our moment in this book. But I think all of us can engage in that together, because as much as we obsess over what's wrong and what is broken and what is being broken and what is falling apart, we've got to be thinking imaginatively about what can rise from the ashes and how we can make it rise. We can't ever stop thinking about what we want and what we're for, even as we're fighting all these things that we're against. Thank you all. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you, Kirk. And this is the end. Bring it to my face like a rock star. So thanks all for tuning in. We will see you next week is TBD, but we have upcoming events which include protest songs and talking about education. See you then.